that's EY. So in terms of today's topic, the impact of climate change is now impossible to ignore. This year alone in July, we saw the 3 hottest days on record ever. And while wildfires and floods have caused catastrophic damage in many countries around the world. So the need for governments to speed up action to reduce emissions couldn't be more urgent. 150 countries around the world have now committed to getting to net zero, and current government decarbonisation policies are mobilising some $75 trillion to try and abate climate change impact by 2050. However, research by EY and the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, so FIDIC, has found that this investment isn't sufficient to fully decarbonise our economies, and that there's an investment gap of something like $64 trillion. So in today's webinar, we're going to hear a bit more about that research. And in particular, we're going to look at how different countries around the world are catalysing investment in sustainable infrastructure through collaboration with the broader infrastructure community of asset owners, investors, innovators, and businesses. We've got 4 fantastic speakers with us today, and in a moment I'm going to introduce each of those and ask them to give some introductory remarks. But this is very much your webinar, so what we're going to do is allow as much time as possible as well for you to put your questions to our panel. So on the device you're using, somewhere you should see a Q&A button on your device. Please use that Q&A feature at any point from now on to message in your questions. And once we've heard from our speakers, I'll get through as many of those questions as we can before the end of the webinar. So let's go over to our panel. And first we will hear from Jonathan Morris, who is Director of Infrastructure at EY and part of its Global Infrastructure Leadership Team. He's got over 20 years' experience in the development and delivery of infrastructure mega projects across road, rail, aviation, energy, and government sectors. Then we will hear from Graham Pontin, who is Director of Policy, External Affairs and Communications at FIDIC, where he oversees a number of key areas of work, including policy, advocacy and lobbying, economic research and media relations. Graham's an economist with skills in market research, policy development and implementation. Then we will head over to Canada, where we'll hear from Jody Palmer, who is Head of Project Development for Western Canada at the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And he's also the national lead for CIB's investment activities in agriculture and agri-food. Jody has almost 30 years of experience in lending to, structuring and advising on project finance and public-private partnerships transactions across a variety of infrastructure asset classes. And then last, but by no means least, we go all the way over to Australia. And I'm really, really grateful that Jennifer has stayed up so late. It's 1 o'clock over there. So we will hear from Jennifer Jenkins, who is Associate Director of Project Advisory and Evaluation at Infrastructure Australia, which is the independent infrastructure advisor to the Australian government. Jennifer leads the evaluation of transport, water, energy and communications infrastructure proposals in Australian government funding. And she also leads Infrastructure Australia's work to support the Australian government objectives to decarbonise infrastructure and better consider sustainability and resilience in infrastructure planning and appraisal. So I'm sure you'll agree with me, we really do have a great panel here. As I said, please use this opportunity to put your questions to our panel using that Q&A feature, and we'll get to those once we've heard from our speakers. And with that, I'm going to invite Jonathan to give the first of our presentations. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, and welcome everybody. Thank you for inviting me onto this panel. And we thought that a good way of setting the scene would be to articulate the work that EY has been doing as a knowledge partner with FIDIC in the global consulting engineering community on what the gap to achieve net zero is in sustainable infrastructure, to contextualise the conversation on how government and infrastructure players compose the gap. And where we think we've got to on this is that 2023 is clearly a pivotal year. It's been, a year of unprecedented weather events, but it's also a year of hope and an exciting time for change if we can grab it and make advantage of the opportunity to convert it into real action. So the next few slides will set out what our report says at the high level, and hopefully that will contextualise the discussion. If we can go to the next slide, please, Anne. So what you can see on the slide in front of you here is the problem statement. So under the current policies that governments have set out around the world, emissions are unfortunately expected to increase by a further 30% by 2050. And what that means is that we'll reach our 1.5 degree carbon budget, which is to limit warming above pre-industrial levels around about 2030, approximately in the next 7 years. We're about 1.2 degrees today, and we'll reach 1.5 by about 2030. And unfortunately, we would also, on the current trajectory, look to breach 2 degrees before 2050 as well. So the net zero target doesn't quite get us to where we need to be. The modelling we've done in EY has demonstrated that over 50% of all global emissions come from either advanced countries or advanced emerging economies like the US, China, India, the EU27 and the UK. And there is a significant disparity between the ability of advanced and emerging economies to be able to find the right path through to net zero. So what we've got is a challenge where we need to decarbonize in the advanced economies, but avoid the developing economies that want to achieve, quite understandably, economic growth from carbonizing on their same journey. Next slide, please. So, some examples of the extreme weather events we've seen this year. I think 2023 is the first year of having over $100 billion of insurance payouts for weather events worldwide. And we've seen that play out in a number of wildfires in Hawaii. We've seen hurricanes in North America, the Mont Blanc glacier retreat, and also the Rhodes wildfire. So, we've seen that really take place this year. I think it's been described by some as the summer of global boiling, but this is the year that the effects of it are really becoming apparent. So the need for action is urgent. At the same time, there are millions of examples of human ingenuity to tackle climate change, some of which are really taking off. And even after our report was published in September, there's a couple of even more positive reports that have come out the last week or two that provide further confidence in that. It's just we're not quite going fast enough. Next slide, please. So what is the gap? I think Siobhan articulated this in the executive summary at the start of the session. We're roughly spending just over half of what we need to on our current policy trajectory to achieve net zero by 2050, about 53%. And global annual spend needs to increase from 2 trillion a year to 5 trillion a year in the next 7 years. That's a rough increase of 2.5 times. And that is pretty urgent to be able to stay within our existing carbon budget to keep warming beneath 1.5 degrees and achieve a trajectory that minimizes the negative effects of climate change. Next slide, please. So what we see here is that by far the greatest area in which investment is needed is in energy, particularly in electrification. We see the 5 key steps to delivering investment in the most effective areas for achieving net zero as being, number one, deploy renewables. So, in many instances now, offshore wind and solar is cheaper than gas, but that has to be deployed at scale, and the transmission and distribution of that linked to the grid as soon as possible. The second step is to electrify everything: electric vehicles, charging infrastructure, public transport, and electrifying heating and buildings and industries, and try and deliver the 15-minute cities as well, where we reduce the need for carbon-intensive travel. The third one then being to deliver sustainable fuels. So it won't be possible for everything to be electrified. In aviation and maritime industries, there might be a need for cleaner net zero fuels off the electric grid, using hydrogen, ammonia, and things like that. Fourthly, to decarbonize heavy industry, chemical production, steel, electric blast furnaces. And finally, to abate any of the really hard to reach carbon emissions with carbon capture and storage. So you can see that through that journey that the first 2 are in a zone right now, which are becoming increasingly deployable at speed and scale. The last 3 are a bit more technologically complicated and will be harder to deliver for emerging economies to advanced economies. But there's been a huge amount of change in the last 10 years just on the first 2. And we see that there is potentially equal change to happen in the subsequent 10 years, which will allow us to deploy all of that. Next slide, please. So what you see on this slide is actually a list of commitments that FIDIC, the Global Organization of Consulting Engineers, which I mentioned, have made to help us achieve the closure of that gap. What you don't see on this slide are the 5 recommendations from the report. You see just the commitments from the report. But the 5 recommendations we had to close the gap were, number one, we need to get a new grading system to rate the sustainability of infrastructure projects worldwide. So we often find that it's not always clear what are the most effective projects, both in removing carbon from the atmosphere, but also avoiding adding additional carbon in through their construction. So FIDIC have made a commitment to create a think tank to define a new sustainability rating standard for infrastructure projects, which will allow us to identify the most sustainable investments. The second one is to help governments convert their net zero policy ambition into a clear pathway plan. The plan won't be the same for each country, but going back to the slides talking about earlier, what we need to do, we need to get the most effective projects deployed as quickly as possible, the most bang for our buck. So we want to prioritize them, initiate them, deploy them as soon as possible. The earlier we remove carbon, the better. The third one is to then create a global repository of successful project case studies that allow us to take learning from the projects that are able to initiate and set themselves up and deploy as quickly as possible, so you can actually deliver these to the point where they are able to actually have an impact as soon as possible, and avoiding the lengthy delays that sometimes can prohibit rapid project initiation. And FIDIC have made a commitment on that as well to help us build it. The fourth one then is to create and build towards creating a global platform that can help us to certify the most investable products with consistent investment taxonomy, and allow people to build confidence in their governance and identify how we can matchmake the dry powder of funding which is already out there with the investment pipeline. And the last one is to, Graham will touch on this I'm sure, is to an offer from FIDIC to work with policymakers and financial institutions to identify those regulatory and policy levers that can help facilitate investment. It does say there about a carbon balance sheet approach, and it's also about the pricing incentives, the return on investment, which links to the environmental return and the ESG governance that people now look for, as well as the return on investment from an economic perspective. Next slide, please. And there is hope. Very important to emphasize this, that the global community has come together in the past to take concerted and coordinated action on the climate. The two examples here from the last 30 years relate to the abatement of acid rain and the reversal of the depleted ozone layer, which is now a very, very positive news story. More recently than that, earlier this year, the UN did agree, after many years of negotiation, an agreement to protect up to a third of the world's oceans. Only last week, the International Energy Authority released a new report showing that the world is now on an unstoppable shift towards renewables. In 2020, only 3 years ago, 1 in 25 cars were electric that were sold, and this year, so far, we're tracking at 1 in 5 electric cars. Wind and solar are getting cheaper all the time, and their conclusion was that the switch to renewables and electrification is now a matter of when and not if. So we are on the right trajectory. Well, we're getting towards being on the right trajectory. It needs to go a little bit faster, but we are getting there. Next slide, please. So, I think the challenge to all of us in the infrastructure community, engineering community, advisors, government, is how we can all work together to deliver these commitments. And in particular, what action can we take in the next 12 months to help close the gap? We know that on our current trajectory, climate change is on course to hit 2 degrees before 2050. We're not spending enough. How can we identify the most investable projects now that achieve the most impact? How can we accelerate them? How can we work together not just to initiate them from a policy point of view, but to champion and sponsor the rapid deployment of those projects on the ground to achieve the impact as soon as we can, whilst unlocking those longer term blockers to the more higher technology requirements to deliver net zero in the longer term. We think government has a very big role to play in this, not just from a policy and regulatory perspective, but also from sponsoring those projects through sharing the learning, bringing people together and helping to share the learning. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion, sharing the ideas across the community and seeing how we can unlock human ingenuity to deliver the objectives on net zero. Thank you very much. And with that, I might just hand over to Graham, who was going to pick up on a bit more about what FIDIC are doing off the back of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan. The first thing I'd emphasise is I'd like to thank EY for their collaboration over the last year as part of the Global Leadership Forum in producing the report. Just for people in the webinar, you can see the details of the report are up on screen, so you can actually go and download it. As we've alluded to in there, it does go into various sectors and various areas of the globe and the challenge that's needed and the scale of it. But what I'd like to do is frame where we came from and where we think we're going around the report and the challenge that's been set So if we go to the next slide, please. So effectively, if you go back 18 months ago, FIDIC decided to set up its Global Leadership Forum out of the work it's done with its Sustainable Development Committee and its Climate Change Charter, which is all set to try and make the infrastructure sector, the engineering sector, from individuals through to companies, corporations, and their own member associations, take a shift towards a more sustainable future and put us on the path to net zero. Now, the Global Leadership Forum doesn't just look at sustainability, but the carbon issue was one that we felt was most as appropriate for the, if you like, the first set tranche of work that it does. So if we go to the next slide, you can see that across the board, we considered lots and lots of challenges and opportunities that are out there. Ironically, the only challenge that's on that slide that you won't see is sustainability, because whether you're talking about communities, technology, energy systems, water systems, it fits across absolutely everything. And the challenge to get to net zero will not be undertaken by one person or one government or one company. It will have to be undertaken by society as a whole and the various operators within it. This is from investors through to contractors, through to engineers. Everybody will have to go on this journey, and it is a significant journey. I mean, we've got only just about 2,500 days to meet the SDG targets, I mean, which include universal energy supply and safe clean water. That's not actually that long. If you take weekends out, you take about 700 of those days off. We are running against time. So if we go on to the next slide, I'd like to outline that this report forms part of the scale of the challenge, but actually alongside it at the Global Leadership Forum and in our conference in September, there were other reports that were linked to it to try and take the macro right through to the pragmatic view of how we've got to start addressing the challenge. So the EY report, as I said, outlined the scale of the challenge. We also published another set of research on carbon balance sheets. So this very much starts to look at, well, how do we actually measure carbon over projects from start to finish? How do you turn around and measure the change of it over time? What does a good project look like? All of these sort of, if you like, systems are going to have to be in place. And at the moment, at the first summit, we had a number of companies actually put their hand up and volunteer to try and create this sort of mechanism and start sharing data to get to these things. The next one also then went down into the level of actual projects and measurement themselves. So in this one, we very much talk about best practice that's out there at the moment. The only way we're going to turn around and reach net zero is if where we have best practice, we share it. If we're not sharing information, no one knows whether they're doing well, bad, or indifferent. And it's going to be vital that we share that. The final publication that was put out that we did with WWF and was released in Singapore takes that one step further. It doesn't just ask about net zero. It actually publishes nature positive infrastructure solutions. It has about 20 case studies at the back, but it provided a meta-analysis of over 200 nature positive projects across the globe. So these very much, it suggests what the benefits are, what you have to do to get there, what the challenges are. So these are tools that can be there practically to help the sector implement the changes that we need to go forward. So you can see the work is going around things. If we look forward to the next 12 months, we will still be collaborating with EY. We're going to look at how digital technology will start to play a role in some of this, whether it be in measurement. That will include artificial intelligence, because there is a significant potential for artificial intelligence to play a role as we move towards net zero. We're also looking at things like energy systems. As Jonathan mentioned, the energy sector is going to be one of the biggest sectors where we can actually probably make significant change early on to turn around and try and address a lot of the challenge. So we've got to, the message is really, we've got to bring together the whole infrastructure community, everybody from outline projects right through to final delivery and decommissioning, to actually make sure that we achieve this going forward. And with that, I'll hand back over to you, Siobhan.
Brilliant, Graham. Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you. Great way to set the scene for our next two speakers and for the conversation afterwards as well. So I think a couple of things that I think really got there. Jonathan, you set up brilliantly the kind of scale of the challenge, the situation where we are, and also kind of where the key investments are needed, as you say, starting with that big block that you showed on energy, but that investment in electrification, in renewables, and all of those other issues there. And then both of you stressing the importance, I think, of how do we measure the kind of sustainability of a project? How do we know what the carbon footprint is of an end-to-end of a large infrastructure project? The importance of having some kind of globally recognized standard on measurement, maybe, of those, which I think Jennifer might be interested in and might pick up on when we hear from her in a short while. And then that real sense of, because we need to move faster, how do we prioritize? How do we know where we're going to get the most, as Jonathan said, bang for the buck, in terms of which projects we kind of prioritize? And then people might be really interested in what you said there at the end, Graham, in how new technologies, including things like AI, are going to become increasingly part of this picture going forward. And then finally, that need for everybody to come together, in particular what we're talking about today, that whole infrastructure community, to be working together on this. Thank you so much to both of you for those first presentations. Jody, I'm coming over to you now.
Thanks, Siobhan. Greetings to your global audience from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, not too far from the Rocky Mountains, to help orient you as to where I am. It's a pleasure to be here today, and quite excited to speak to a global audience. Next slide, please. So a bit of background about CIB. We're an impact investor investing in infrastructure for the public good of Canadians. And by public good, an example that is relevant to today's discussion is that we measure the impact in the reduction in GHGs that our investments make. So what's the per ton, how many dollars from CIB does it take to reduce 1 ton of GHGs, as an example? Our investment philosophy is to attract private capital or institutional capital into revenue-generating infrastructure projects while achieving a balanced risk-reward allocation. We provide investments, either debt or equity, depending upon the needs and the risks of the project. We do not provide grants. That's a policy tool that's used by other parts of the federal government here in Canada. But our approach is to undertake investments while crowding in private and institutional capital to catalyze action towards the necessary actions required to mitigate the impact of climate change. We lend or invest against future revenue streams associated with projects. And that allows us to fill investment gaps, and also allows the Government of Canada to act in a fiscally prudent manner, as we're not providing grants that don't have to be paid back, but rather investments that will be paid back over the tenor of our investment, which can be 7 years, 15, 25, 35 years, depending upon the specific project and investment. Next slide, please. The bank has 5 priority sectors: public transit, anything from light rail transit, bus, rapid transit systems, to the assisting public transit authorities in Canada to convert from diesel buses to electric or hydrogen buses. We're technology agnostic. Clean power, green infrastructure has a number of subsectors. There we're investing in water, wastewater, building retrofits, industrial retrofits. For example, we provided a credit facility to Algoma Steel to convert from coal-fired furnaces to electric arc furnaces. We're also undertaking building retrofits for institutional buildings, multi-res, office buildings, and the like. And the other subsector within green infrastructure is what we call energy transition. That is low carbon fuels, such as biomethanol, sustainable aviation fuel, renewable diesel, but also hydrogen and carbon capture. Our fourth sector is broadband, where we're looking to provide digital connectivity to rural, remote, northern, and indigenous communities. Trade and transport is our fifth sector. And there, that's everything from toll roads and bridges, ports, airports. Another subsector within there is agriculture and agri-food. And most recently, we've added a mandate to invest in the enabling infrastructure for critical minerals as well. Then across all five of those investment sectors, we also have a public policy objective in regards to reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous peoples. And so we have a team that's focused specifically on Indigenous community infrastructure investments as well. And then we also have a fund to accelerate projects where we're making investments prior to the final investment decision. And we're making investments to help advance for public sector projects, business cases, feasibility studies, and then for private sector projects, the front-end engineering and design for the energy transition projects as well. Next slide, please. We have partnerships across the country. The bank has deployed $10 billion to date, and that has allowed us to leverage private and institutional capital, plus some grant funding from various levels of government in Canada. So our 10 billion has catalyzed just under $30 billion of projects across the country. Next slide, please. The bank is very much focused on the impact of our investments. So we've achieved through the 10 billion investments a reduction of 5 megatons of GHGs, 174,000 daily transit riders, 200,000 new acres of irrigated land, 340,000 households connected to broadband in rural, remote, northern, and indigenous communities. And we've made approximately $130 million in investments for 7 indigenous projects that are in 6 different provinces. Next slide, please. So the bank is part of the federal government of Canada's toolkit. That toolkit is comprised of carbon tax. It's comprised of regulations, but it's so you can refer to those as disincentives or sticks and to motivate behavior. And then there are carrots or incentives to move towards net zero. And the bank is part of those incentives as we provide concessional financing. But there are other parts of the federal government that provide those incentives as well. Next slide, please. So here's a slide that depicts some specific examples where there is the impact is a reduction in GHGs that is leading towards net zero. The Becabar Wind Project also, we invested alongside Indigenous communities. So it isn't one or the other. There are oftentimes we're able to achieve the impact of reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous peoples, plus achieving reduction in GHGs. We've made an investment of just under $1 billion Canadian into a small modular nuclear reactor in Ontario as well. Next slide, please. So there's a QR code there that you can learn more about the bank. We also have a website that has significant detail about working with the bank and how the bank works. Thank you very much.
Jody, thank you so much. Really good to get that perspective from the centre of the Canadian government, essentially, where you are kind of working very closely with them. So again, stressing some of those issues, I think, that we heard in the earlier presentations around the importance of partnerships, so how you're working in partnership with so many people across Canada. Interesting what you said, that the 10 billion that you've put in from the bank has actually amounted to kind of 30 billion overall in terms of investment. So really good to see that. And then also you stressing the importance of impact, that measuring how successful these projects are. So going forward, you know which ones give you the best return on that investment. And I love the way that you position yourself there as part of the toolkit, as you said, of the Canadian government. So you've got things like tax and regulation, which are the kind of sticks, so to speak, and you're part of the carrots in that toolkit, because you create this enabling environment and create incentives in that way. Thank you, Jody. Really interesting to hear from the Canadian perspective. And similarly, now we'll go over to Jennifer to hear more from what she's doing in Australia.
Thanks, Siobhan. Good morning or good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. It's been lovely to hear from my peers across the globe. I'll jump into talking about how we've been dealing with these challenges in infrastructure in Australia. We can go to the next slide. I'm joining from Sydney. And if there's any noise in the background, it's 1 a.m. My cats are wondering what is going on. Okay, so Infrastructure Australia is the Australian government's independent infrastructure advisor. We're an independent statutory authority reporting to the Federal Minister for Infrastructure, and we provide independent advice on nationally significant infrastructure, future needs and priorities. That's achieved through our two main functions of evaluating the business cases for infrastructure proposals seeking more than 250 million in Australian government funding. We cover transport, water, energy and communication sectors. We also have a team that develops research and advice to provide advice to the government on the broader opportunities to improve infrastructure decision making. So next slide, please. Now, last year, in 2022, a new government was elected, and they introduced our first national climate change legislation. So prior to that, a lot of the heavy lifting in response to climate change in infrastructure and other sectors was done by subnational governments. The government that was elected in May last year introduced the Climate Change Act, which legislated our nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, setting our emissions reduction targets at 43% reduction from 2005 levels by 2030 and net zero by 2050. Another interim target is scheduled to be released next year. That will be our next, our 2035 interim target. As part of that suite of legislative reform, there was a range of consequential amendments made to other legislation, including our governing legislation, the Infrastructure Australia Act, and a whole range of other infrastructure bodies and investment agencies, which introduced a requirement for consideration of Australia's net zero emission targets across our respective work streams, mainly in investment decision making. So, and for Infrastructure Australia, in our evaluation of business cases, in our advice to government, and also in the infrastructure plans and audits that we regularly publish and make available. Next slide, please. So in response to that legislative change, Infrastructure Australia published earlier this year a very high-level guide to assessing greenhouse gas emissions at the infrastructure project scale. It's been, you know, and just reflecting on what others have spoken about, it's been really interesting to, you know, to come from a policy environment where there wasn't a strong national focus and policy and regulatory settings for achieving, you know, abatement outcomes and emissions reduction targets, and to sort of, you know, from sort of coming potentially from the back of the pack to this sort of situation where, you know, these measures have been introduced federally under our watch, and to see the, you know, the amount of work and energy and collaboration that's happening across infrastructure and other sectors has really been amazing to see how much this has driven action and really tangible results to work towards to achieving those goals already. And so we introduced this technical guide about assessing greenhouse gas emissions in the project scale. At the project scale, we assess infrastructure proposal cost benefit analysis. So this includes requirements to quantify and monetize greenhouse gas emissions in infrastructure proposals. It's very much one link in the chain. You know, sadly, cost benefit analysis is probably a fairly blunt policy instrument, much to the disappointment of us economists. But, you know, as part of a suite of reforms in that sort of, you know, driving incentives to avoid and mitigate emissions at the infrastructure design stage, and further requirements to demonstrate that procurement measures and risks have been adequately considered in the project delivery stage, valuation of emissions at the cost benefit analysis stage, you know, ensures that there's that consistency across the infrastructure project life cycle. Next slide, please. And in the guidance that we provide, cost benefit analysis obviously intended to consider the full social impacts and social well-being of an infrastructure project. So as others have mentioned, there's definitely very significant social impacts of climate change that we see in extreme weather events, and, you know, productivity impacts in health, you know, in across all kinds of sectors. So definitely needs to be considered as an externality in cost benefit analysis. It's considered across all stages of our evaluation process where we have existing requirements to identify the problem or opportunity that the infrastructure proposal is seeking to address. Looking at then the next stage of our evaluation process where we're asking for proponents to analyse a range of options, including no build options, and then in the final business case. Next slide, please. And in terms of the detail in quantifying and monetising, we're primarily looking at this stage of direct and indirect impacts. There is work being done nationally in collaboration with subnational and national agencies to develop a national approach to measuring embodied emissions. I think, you know, that's really one of the next stages that we'd like to see infrastructure getting to. It's a key impact. So those emissions in materials that need to be considered, vegetation loss, you know, land clearing is another significant impact from infrastructure that we see. So there are methods available to estimate the impacts in terms of the loss of carbon sequestration opportunity, and, you know, other impacts in terms of transportation, fugitive emissions as well. Next slide, please. And what we're seeing so far from the proposals that we're receiving and our own research that we're been completing is that in terms of like a standard road project, which is often quite a big part of our work, that the cost of emissions has a relatively small impact on the costs, given the scale of a large scale road projects, a relatively small impact on the cost, but a very significant impact for sustainability. So having values and ways to measure emissions at the project scale can really incentivise delivering sustainability focused projects. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, some of the gaps for us around having a consistent national approach to measuring embodied emissions, a national value for use, national emissions value for use in cost-benefit analysis, and more a detailed scope of the relevant emissions to count and consider at the project scale. Next slide. And I think just in wrapping up, definitely, a very clear role for government to set clear national targets, policy and regulation, end-to-end emission reductions frameworks to ensure that emissions are considered across the infrastructure life cycle, from project design to procurement, decommissioning, ensuring that we're counting the costs of externalities as well as the benefits of reducing emissions, and prioritising and measuring, monetising the main source of emissions. Obviously, we're all on the clock to achieve those targets, and all those emissions will count. We have seen in some countries there's been, with cost of living pressures, a drive to de-scope or put on hold some of the sustainability projects. We very much see that society is already paying the costs of climate change in terms of insurance premiums, in health outcomes, in cleanup costs. So, we would consider that, avoiding, those sort of projects that will deliver, abatement and will deliver reduced emissions is really a false economy. So, and I shall just leave it there.
Jennifer, thank you so much, Jennifer. Really interesting to hear about what Infrastructure Australia do. But again, I think you've also stressed a lot of those issues that I think we've heard from all of our speakers there. So I think the importance of regulation and how you said having that new legislation in place was really a step change in terms of kind of action across Australia. Mentioning as well there the importance of having a nationally agreed measurement, so how you're actually pricing in emissions of greenhouse gas emissions into that cost benefit process, really becoming the incentive for people to focus on sustainable projects. And then that whole sense, I think, that you've all covered of the role of government to really set this enabling environment so that people can have confidence in the investments, but also, as you were pointing out there, Jennifer, knowing which projects are having the most impact and being able to prioritize projects because you're getting the measurement right. And then you brought in, I think, a really important point at the end, that there is a danger, I think, with the cost of living crisis, that some of these projects don't go ahead because they're considered too costly, but actually the cost of not taking action, I think, can be hugely overlooked. Thank you to all of you for those great presentations. I also want to throw in something, because I thought it'd be really good for we've had loads of questions coming in, which is great. We're going to go straight to those. But I love, Jonathan, what you said at the beginning about there is hope. Because I think sometimes when you're talking about net zero, it can all sound so overwhelming that people kind of freeze a bit, but actually having those two examples that you gave of the ozone and acid rain, and we can, if the world comes together, make a difference. We can do this again. So I think that's a really good way to frame the conversation. I'm going to go straight to questions because we've had some great questions coming in. Firstly, just to reply to everyone, yes, we will send round the slides. So to everybody who's asked, we will send round the slides, so you'll all get all of those, don't worry. And Jodie, there's a question that was directly to you. Shelley Johnson has asked, who should they contact if they want to talk to somebody about the Indigenous programme? The cheekiness of that was, is it you? But I don't want to put you on the spot. Is there just somewhere on the website maybe that people can look if they want a contact for the Indigenous programme?
There is. So if you use the QR code or go to our website, you will find a link or an email link to get you to be connected with our Indigenous team. But always feel free also to connect with me, and I can connect you with our Indigenous
and we
team.
can send that QR code around as well, so we'll make sure we do that. I'm going to come to the questions now. I'm going to start with a question that Eleanor Bryan sent in, because I really like this question, which is, how do you catalyse public sector decarbonisation? For example, social housing retrofits, so retrofitting kind of housing stock, which I think you touched on, Jodie, when investors are unable or unlikely to make a good commercial return from this. So again, Jodie, I'll start with you. We'll shake up the order a little bit, because you mentioned there was always a kind of return on the investment. Is that the case? Would that also be the case for something like social housing retrofitting?
So our program for building retrofits is predicated upon, we make the upfront investment alongside the private or institutional capital. And then the revenue stream or the savings associated with that investment. So that could be utility savings, reduction in the carbon price that you pay. You may get a revenue stream associated with an investment tax credit, as an example. So that, and the bank offers a sliding scale of investments. So for public sector or social housing, we would be prepared to provide up to 70% of the overall capital. The other 30% would have to come from private or institutional capital. And then our pricing for our investment is tied to the reduction in GHGs. So if you achieve a 30% reduction, we provide our financing at Government of Canada plus 100 basis points. If you achieve a 40% reduction, we provide that financing at a Government of Canada rate. And then if you achieve 50% or greater, including net zero, then we provide our financing out at the Government of Canada minus 100 basis points. So we're providing an incentive to go deeper. And we, in addition to everything from the low-hanging fruit like lighting, but HVAC systems, building envelope, we're trying to catalyze deeper retrofits, and then also fuel switching from fossil fuels to electrification or other low carbon fuels, and then also behind the fence, behind the meter, renewables, clean power generation, energy storage, and then our fourth sub-offering for building retrofits is that we'll provide financing for electric vehicle or hydrogen refueling as well at specific sites as well. So that's the general approach that the bank is taking in this space.
Thanks, Jodie. I think Eleanor's probably thinking of, projects that have an obvious kind of ongoing kind of financial return in them, but I think there's a slightly different way of looking at this. Jonathan Graham, did you want to comment on these types of projects? I think that Eleanor's talking about where, maybe it's harder for private investors to see what the commercial return would be for them.
I mean,
yeah. Do you want to go first, Graham?
Yeah, thank you. So what I was going to say is that yes, there will always be projects where they're more difficult, but across the globe there are various mechanisms that are used. I mean, for example, a number of countries now have started using land values and capital values to turn around and help drive investments. And fundamentally, over time, the prices and finances around investing in things like social housing stuff do change. I mean, as we move into climate change more, the insurance industry is going to play an important role. Risk is going to play an important role. And if you're not investing in your property and things aren't improving, you're not staying, you're static compared to everybody else who is moving as society changes. So the economics do change over time, and there will be shifts in the way investment occurs. So it's not just a static down, and there are, as I said, there are several mechanisms that governments try to use to encourage people to invest in them. I mean, if you look at solar and the take up of that over the last 15 years and how the costs have changed, it's significantly different to if we were having this discussion 15 years ago.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Jonathan, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, thanks, Rog. Very briefly, I think there are two aspects to the question. The question is around, commercial returns for social housing, where, it might be immediately obvious. There's two questions. One is on capital and one is on return. So, on capital, do they have the money to pay for, solar heat pumps? No. So there's a question on how, you get the money in to do that and the retrofit. On the return, I think there might actually be a more positive story. This came out in the UK National Infrastructure Commission report last week, that actually solar panels and installation of heat pumps will save people money. When they're actually up and running, it significantly reduces electricity bills and actually saves households money. The issue is that some of the lower income households can't afford to actually pay for it in the first place. So I think there's a couple of options there. There's something about how the government could help see the capital to reduce the cost to them as a government in servicing that social housing in future. But I also think there's more that could be done to tap into the private and philanthropic sector to give them an opportunity to contribute as well.
Thanks, Jonathan. Jennifer, we do have more questions, but did you want to add anything specifically on this particular question?
Just briefly, that I note that in Australia, that many subnational governments have regulated minimum requirements for social housing, and there's also a considerable challenge for the private rental sector as equally as well. That was all.
Yeah, and you saying that, one of the things that struck me when you were talking as well is the added complication maybe of some of these big infrastructure projects, especially in countries where you have a different system of governance, where you're having to work across provinces or regions or different states that have different regulations in place. That's all going to add to the complexity of measuring some of these big projects as well. Okay, we've got other questions coming in. So I'm going to go to Chris Winter, who has asked if there are three main goals associated with climate change. So those being not just net zero, but also resilience and a better future for all. How are you integrating those three goals into infrastructure development? And I think we have all touched on something, because you have mentioned other things as well in some of your presentations. Jennifer, I think you mentioned kind of social well-being, I think was one of the things you mentioned, but how are you taking into account in the cost benefit of measurement of those three wider goals?
Certainly in terms of resilience is a key priority. Public infrastructure very much at risk to climate impacts. That is something that we're looking at, also including guidance to improve the way resilience is considered. It's something that's likely to contribute to project costs. Therefore, we need adequate means to ensure that the benefits of delivering those outcomes are accounted for in cost benefit analysis. What we see is that, where some proponents might be looking at build back better following extreme weather events, that's not going far enough, and that we need to be looking at building back better for climate impacts we're likely to experience in 20 and 30 years that we really can't foresee yet. So that may involve looking at some minimum requirements for RCP levels, testing climate impacts, at the project scale, at the local scale, to assure that they're accounted for, and to ensure that there's sort of deeper engagement with local communities in designing infrastructure so that it is responding to future climate impacts.
Thanks, Jennifer. And Jodie, the same question to you, because Chris has gone on to say, in particular, what's the ability of climate solutions to enhance our quality of life? And that he sees this as critical for ensuring long-term social and political support for infrastructure investments. And I guess one thing in particular, you were talking about, broadband, for example. You gave an example of broadband being rolled out to unserved or underserved communities. So that would be a direct example, I guess, or something. But your thoughts on this kind of ensuring this the wider criteria are met? Sorry, Jody, yeah, come off mute. Thanks.
Yeah, the bank is an impact investor. We are mindful of the broader cost benefit analysis that is undertaken and that Jennifer spoke about. But we have a specific focus on the impact of our investments, and that broader mindfulness helps us achieve the other objectives that have been highlighted through this question. So in broadband, I think the pandemic clearly demonstrated the need for connectivity, for people's social well-being, for health, for education, and the like. So I think that's a prime example of how investments in broadband help achieve a variety of impacts. But what we're doing is we're counting those numbers of households that we're giving that opportunity for digital connectivity.
Thanks, Jody. And Jonathan, similarly to you, I guess there's not really a trade-off, is there, between making something more sustainable for the environment and also making it better for the quality of life going forward, because they kind of go hand in hand, don't they?
They do go hand in hand, Siobhan. So I fear I may be answering a different question here from what I saw in the chat. I think one of the questions was one thing you could change. What would it be that you could change? I'd almost like us to see flipping the conversation on its head, actually, rather than talking about sustainability as a sacrifice, start to talk much more about its benefits. It's not all just about wearing a hair shirt. That a lot of these things will save people money, enhance their quality of life, give them clean air, make things better. And I think sort of pivoting the conversation in that direction would be very beneficial. To the question on how take into account net zero, resilience, and a better future for all. I think in the UK, in particular now, we have a body called the Infrastructure and Projects Authority that the big government projects looks to assure the business case prior to agreeing any injection of big government funding. And they're now starting to look much more at how the business case for each project addresses UN Sustainable Development Goals as interpreted through UK policy. So, Jennifer talked about Build Back Better. We have a very similar thing in the UK. Post-pandemic, our policy in Build Back Better, levelling up around the country for economic inclusion, and Green Industrial Revolution, which is about creating a new green industries that allow us to deliver sustainable infrastructure, but at the same time making it inclusive for as many people as possible from a social perspective and economic perspective. So I think we can tell a much stronger story on it, and I think we can also tell a much more positive story about it.
Thanks, Jonathan. Graham, I'm going to come to you with a different question, if that's okay. You can chip in on the other one if you like, but I think this one is very relevant for what you said about kind of gathering that commitment to gathering case studies of good practice and making sure that they are shared across the kind of infrastructure community. So Della Hoyi has asked, how do you deal with the tragedy of commons when it comes to net zero, where each nation is pursuing its own path to climate change? There's no global authority to impose the targets. But I kind of want to broaden that a little bit, which is, why are we not all working more closely together and collaborating on the best way to achieve some of our goals?
I mean, I think it would be fair to say there is a lot of collaboration going on. As Jonathan said, there is a positive story. I mean, FIDIC as the global body for engineers, we're certainly collaborating across the 100-odd countries we cover to turn around and share best practice and actually engage people in the conversation about how you turn around and deliver the best net zero. But I think it is also quite important to recognise that countries are all at different stages on this journey. So it is important that they are also adapting and being able to set policy levers and frameworks and regulations that take account of their own environment and the challenges they are facing. That does not mean that there is not coordination. If you look at COP and the United Nations, there are several things that are going, and even the Paris Agreement. These are the sort of things where they're collaborating. You don't necessarily necessarily need to have a legal body at the top that is going to sit and sort of constantly remind people. Actually, there is a lot of effort in the global community to move towards these, and broadly, I mean, there is a consensus that we do need to get there. So I think it is already probably a much more positive story. I mean, sure, you can always argue there is more that can be done. I mean, if you look at the playbook case studies, when you mentioned the previous one about positive and community, actually a lot of the studies in there where they've delivered sort of solutions that aren't traditional concrete in ground give people like recreation areas and things like that, which actually benefit society. And I do think that's important, is that as we go down this journey, you're going to need to bring society and communities with you, because communities won't want to turn around and see change which makes them poorer or worse off or not being able to access things they did before. So it is important that we all engage in the debate going forward and all engage in the progress we want to make. I mean, one of the reports that we put out suggested actually having a target that ran alongside net zero about resources. It's no good getting to net zero if we turn around and use all of the rare earth minerals on the planet to get there. That's no more sustainable than actually solving the carbon problem. So it is a complex issue, and we do need to turn around and share information and practice so that we can get there as effectively as possible.
Thanks, Graham. So building on that, I'd like to put that to Jennifer and Jody, considering where you're sitting. Do you think there is enough kind of sharing of information and sharing of approaches and good practice between different governments around the world? So Jennifer, you were saying, you know, Australia has quite recently brought in their legislation. You've quite recently started to factor in measurement of greenhouse gas emissions into cost benefit. There are other countries that would already have been doing that. To what extent did you look to other countries before you built your own approach to that?
I think it's the first thing we did. So, yeah, we've been very fortunate to be able to draw on the work that's been done internationally and also at subnational level within Australia. And I can certainly vouch for Graham's point that we've met with FIDIC representatives in Australia and collaborating and consulting broadly across government and industry and other sectors. It's you know, I think an acknowledgement that it's such a broad and multifaceted problem, that it's not something that any sector, you know, in terms of, you know, government, private or civil society, that can be undertaken alone. And I take great encouragement from the results of the last COP at COP27, that despite you know, what we'd all gone through globally during COVID, that there was a firm focus on staying on target and achieving emissions reduction targets. So, you know, I see there's a lot of room for positivity and ongoing collaboration.
Thanks, Jennifer. Jody, you're nodding. Is that your kind of your thinking as well? And after that, there's a very specific question for you. But in terms of collaboration, do you think enough is happening between different governments?
It's happening. I think today's forum is a prime example of that sharing of what we're all doing. Obviously, more could be done, but I think it is happening. For example, the bank participates in a global CCUS forum as an example. So that sharing is happening within countries amongst various levels of government, but also it's happening globally as well. And so, hands off, you know, hats off, Siobhan, to you and your organization for convening events such as this to facilitate that sharing.
Yeah, thanks, Jody. And the specific question for you, Jody, was, is there any extra advantages that will be given to private companies of having a more green portfolio? For example, high-risk green investments, can they get a higher guarantee loan? I think this was what you were saying about the bank part of being part of the carrot side of things.
Yeah, I mean, our legislation allows us to provide loan guarantees. To date, we have not provided one to date. Our preference has been to make direct investments in specific projects to catalyze private and institutional investment towards achieving climate change goals. But yes, very much the deeper you go in regards to a reduction in GHGs, the greater the percentage of the capital stack that we're likely to be prepared to participate in, and also the concessionality that we're prepared to provide is likely to increase as well. So we provide a very bespoke, customized investment specific to a project and the impact that that project is having.
Thanks, Jody. Okay, I can't believe how quickly, I've just looked at the clock, I can't believe how quickly the time has gone. So we've probably only got time for one more round of questions, but I'm going to ask 2 questions because we've got lots still unanswered. To everyone who we can't answer all your questions during the webinar, I'll see if we can get them answered afterwards behind the scenes. So we'll see if we can do that for you. But to our panel, I'm gonna take 2 of these questions, and you can choose to answer one or both, but we'll have to keep the answers quite quick in terms of this final round. So the first question is from John Wilmot French, and I think this goes back to everything you all said about the need for more urgency and pace if we're going to meet our objectives. And it was, in light of the multiple efforts around the globe to reach net zero, what do you believe are the primary economic, political barriers, economic or social political barriers that are currently hindering the progress we need? So why aren't we seeing more of these sustainable infrastructure projects being rolled out? So any thoughts on what the biggest barriers are to that? And he said, if you could resolve one, what would it be? That's the first question. So what's the biggest barrier and how do you get over it? And then the other one that I thought was a really good question is from Iwan Chan, who has said, and this goes back to what you mentioned, Graham, and they've said, is there a kind of tension between infrastructure development and biodiversity and nature conservation? And are those 2 considered enough together? And I think you did touch on that, Graham. So your thoughts on one or both of those. So what's the biggest barrier to rolling out more sustainable infrastructure projects? And do we consider biodiversity and nature conservation enough when we're thinking about infrastructure projects? I am going to start with you, Jonathan. Your thoughts on one or both of those?
So I'll go for biggest barrier. I think the biggest barrier is simply matchmaking the dry powder and the money that's out there with the most investable projects that are available. So I think to release that, we need to get much clearer on what the priority projects are, or what the investment proposition is, and also move to rapidly initiating them. I'm not sure it's sufficient for governments to just set policy anymore. I think actually clearing the consultation and planning process out of the way and getting to deployment on the ground ASAP is crucial. If we can resolve those 2 things, matchmake the money that's already there looking for a project, and initiate them rapidly, we can very rapidly accelerate.
Thanks, Jonathan. So that real matching has to be done more efficiently than it is now. Thanks. Jody, I'll come to you next.
I think if I can step back, I think policymakers currently are facing headwinds. And that's because we have our climate objectives, but I think in an era now of rising interest rates, and maybe we missed it when the low interest rates were low, but interest rates have gone up. That's affecting the fiscal sustainability of many governments around the world, particularly coming out of the pandemic, where a lot of money was expended to assist citizens around the world. So I think that's definitely one of the challenges. And the other is, in this inflationary environment, there's also what's politically feasible as well. So you almost have this trilemma. Maybe you keep your climate goals fixed, but then, do you provide more carrots or more sticks? What's the right optimal balance in regards to that within the a specific political context, which varies from country to country. But right now, I think people around the world are very, very much focused on pocketbook issues, and I think it's not. I don't begrudge the policymakers, the folks in government, elected officials, that challenge that they're facing. Ultimately, as a policy arm of the government of Canada, we will do our best to achieve whatever objectives they establish for us.
Thanks, Jed. I mean, that's always going to be such a huge challenge, isn't it? How do you keep those long-term goals in place in such politically turbulent times? I think, yeah, really big challenge. Graham, your thoughts on one or both of those questions?
I mean, I think what I'd say as a sort of finishing piece is actually it's quite important that we reframe how we think of things and projects going forward. I mean, if you look at a lot of the nature positive projects that we've been working with WWF on, actually it's procured because it's thought of in a different way. And if we don't turn around as policymakers, as the infrastructure sector, if we carry on trying to operate in the way we have done in the last 25 years, all we'll do is deliver the same as what we have done in the last 25 years. So it needs that sort of shift in mindset. And I think that's something that we've all got to go on a journey together with, because the scale of the challenge of net zero is not small. And as we move towards it, marginal gains will become more difficult to attain. So it is important that we all turn around and are moving in the right direction and the same direction.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. So that needs to all move together, but all move together quite quickly, which itself is a big challenge. Thank you. And finally, over to you, Jennifer, for your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. So I agree, the political context and authorising environment is a challenge, and also just with respect to biodiversity, definitely one of the major impacts in Australia from infrastructure. And you know, as Graham mentioned, we do need that innovative thinking to come up with those nature-based solutions and turn on its head the way we're designing infrastructure, because you know, certainly the impacts to biodiversity and vegetation more generally, yeah, can't continue if we're going to achieve the targets that we've set for ourselves.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I mean, one positive note from me is increasingly, I think people, when we're doing these kinds of webinars and events, are bringing those two different communities together and are trying to see all of this in the round. That joining up does seem to be happening. It's just whether we can speed that up even further. But we are sadly at the end of our time. Thank you so much to all of you. I think we come away there with a sense of there are some really big challenges still ahead, but actually what you're seeing is we can make a difference. The world can make a difference. Governments can make a difference if they create that enabling environment. And there's a lot of hope in this conversation, which is a really nice note to end on, I think. Thank you to all of you, to Jonathan, to Graham, to Jennifer, and to Jodie for lending us so much of your expertise and your time today. Thanks to EY for being our knowledge partner again today as well. We have had a question about, will this webinar be available to watch afterwards? So to everyone in the audience and everyone who registered, yes, we will send around a link after the webinar, and everyone will be able to see, watch the conversation again. You can share it with colleagues far and wide as well. There will also be a write-up of this event as well, which will come out in a few weeks, and that will be sent around to everybody, and you can share that as well. Details of other webinars that we do are on our webinar, so please do take a look at those if you enjoyed today's one. But for me, thank you to the audience, thank you to our panel again, and I hope to see you all very soon at another one of our webinars. Thanks so much to everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are. Thanks. Bye-bye.